Good morning and welcome to I'll Knit If I Want To. I'm Andrea Mowry of Andrea Renee Knits, and this is where I try to answer some of your questions. I feel like my little camera is shaking. Hopefully that stopped it. I also just realized I have very dry hands, so I'm just gonna put on some lotion while we get started. Today I am wearing my birch pullover knit up in birch hollow fibers in their Sojourner base, which is such a lovely yarn. I've used it for socks and now for the sweater, and I love it. So I'll link to it below. Okay, let's answer some questions. All right, question number 1. I have a question about buying the right amount of yarn for a project. Many times, I end up needing to choose a different yarn than what the designer calls for. I do try to find a substitute that is as close to the original in regards to like weight versus yards, but it's not always easy to find a substitute with the same exact ratio. In this case, would you determine the amount you need based on the weight or the yardage? Thanks so much. This is such a great question. Yarn substitutes can be tricky because depending on the fiber content, and the way the yarn is spun, it can drastically change the weight versus yardage ratio. So for instance, a yarn that is woolen spun is going to have quite a few more yards per grams than a yarn that's worsted spun, because the woolen spun yarn's full of air. And so it's going to weigh a lot less than a tightly spun worsted spun yarn, which is going to be heavier. For like quick, easy answer, in that case, I would go towards following the yardage amount instead of the weight. But it's just really good to have that information to kind of consider, okay, if I'm using a yarn that's drastically different in that ratio, it's going to affect the drape and the feel of that sweater or garment or shawl or whatever you're knitting. So I love that you do try to start with like finding something similar, but yeah, I would go by yardage. I very much don't like to play yarn chicken. I do play it all the time because I think that's just part of designing. You try to eke out, like use every bit that you can. But that is where I do recommend buying an extra skein, because yeah, it's kind of a bummer to run out on a project, and you want to have enough for swatching and all that good stuff. But yeah, I would base it on yardage over weight in that case, because the weight can be such a drastic difference. I have published patterns that were done in like a woolen spun yarn like Brooklyn Tweed, Loft, or Shelter, and then I've had testers who used a worsted spun yarn in place, and they're like, wow, my sweater weighs so much more. And I'm like, well, yeah, that's just because your yarn wasn't filled up with air. That sounded so weird, but I'm just gonna roll with it. We're just gonna keep on going. So yeah, there you go. That would be my recommendation. And again, just like with every single thing in knitting, the more you do it, the easier it gets. And you'll find yarns that substitute out really well. There's also like Clara Park's Book of Yarn. There's entire books written on substituting yarn. There's also, I think, classes. Like I would do a little internet search. So if you want to learn more about that, because it's pretty fascinating when you start really getting into all the different kinds of yarns out there, what they can be made up of, how they can be spun, and how that affects the finished project. And we only have so much time to knit and experiment. So having a book kind of lay out what you can expect, I think, is definitely helpful. All right. When knitting sweaters and you need to join the next skein, where do you usually like to do that? Under the arm? Is there a better place or the best way to join the new skein into your knitting? So I have demonstrated, I think twice in these little videos. I personally, if I am using a non-superwash yarn that is animal fibers like wool, I spit splice. I think it is the greatest thing to happen to knitting ever. Because if you knit, like this sweater I only had to weave in like 2 ends because everything else was just spliced in. So I highly recommend the old spit splice. I'm not going to do it again right now just because I don't have anything near me where I can do it. But all you do is you want to kind of fray your 2 ends. This is a superwash yarn, so it wouldn't work. But what I like to do even is separate. Oh, look, perfect. You see that? So I like to separate out some of the plies and maybe snip one off. And you would do that on both ends of the yarn that you need to join. You see that okay? That way it's just not a super bulky area where you're joining. And then you would just either spit in your hand or you could just use a little water. And then you're just going to rub. You get the idea. You're gonna do this and you're gonna felt them, and you can give it a little strength, like a little tug test, and make sure that they are nice and solid. But that is my absolute favorite way to join yarn. I think everyone should do it. But it doesn't work if you are using a plant-based yarn or a superwash yarn. It's any yarn that can't felt can't do it. So in that case, I do prefer to join, if it's a sweater, I would like it to be in the underarms or just somewhere a little less conspicuous, because some yarns, even when you're really, really tidy with the weaving in of ends, it could create a little bulk. Probably no one would ever notice it but you, but for me, I wouldn't necessarily want that to happen in like the middle of the front of the sweater. Although I have definitely run out of yarn like smack dab here and been like, well, just gonna do this. On shawls, I definitely prefer it to be on the edges. Mostly too with shawls, I just feel like they kind of go through a bit more than a sweater with the way, well, at least with how I treat my shawls, you know, like I'm always wrapping them around me. Sometimes they're being shoved in a bag, dragged all over the place. So I just feel like I don't want a random end popping out in the middle of my shawl. I'd rather have it at the edges where they're a little more conspicuous. So inconspicuous, conspicuous, inconspicuous. I think I'm just gonna move on. Next question. My goal for 2022 is to dive deeper into brioche. Woohoo! I've knit a basic brioche hat and I'd like to end the year tackling the baubles shawl. What would you recommend as an intermediate brioche project to bridge the gap between simple 2-color brioche in the round and the skills needed for the baubles shawl? So I should write this one down. Well, if you have the pattern, you're gonna have the links, but I'm just gonna write myself a little note so I don't forget. Baubles shawl links. So the good news is if you've already done a brioche hat, you're in pretty good shape to try now a more advanced pattern as far as the increasing and decreasing would go, because in a hat you've had to decrease the crown. Generally speaking, people find the decreases in brioche trickier than increases. Increases are pretty simple. The baubles shawl, you will need to do, sorry, there's a dog out there just chasing a squirrel and he's just so happy about it. Don't worry, the squirrel got away, safe. That's why I should look at my little green dot instead of out the window. So I think that you're in pretty good shape going from a hat and then progressing from there. It is a little trickier, not trickier, I don't want to use that word. It's just different working brioche flat instead of in the round, but you have already practiced all the skills working 2-color brioche in the round that you will need to do working it flat. Like you've already barked, brioche knit, and burped, brioche purled. So you can do it. I would honestly just practice on a swatch. So cast on like a 2+1 ratio. So I would cast on like 25 stitches and just work basic 2-color brioche flat. I think if you go to my basic brioche tutorial and you look in the show description, I think I actually wrote out the instructions for a swatch like that. So check that out. I'm just going to link my entire brioche playlist so I don't forget. But I also did record a tutorial for like the brioche bobble increases that I do in that shawl. So you could even practice that on your swatch. And yesterday I just finished a new brioche increase video. So I would just check those out and give them a try on a swatch and make sure you feel comfortable and then go from there. But if you were like, no, I really want like a stepping stone, I think that Cinnabar would be a great pattern to try out first, because it includes that syncopated brioche, which Baubles has. And you'll get to do the increases, you'll work it flat. So yeah, I think that would be the best stepping stone in my opinion before doing Baubles. So I'll link that below too. But good luck on your brioche journey. I'm so excited for you. I just started diving into the wonderful world of double brioche, and it is very fun and coming to a shawl pattern near you very soon. All right, let's move on. Kind of a weird question, but do you have any total design fails? They wrote that, not me. I'm not saying this is a weird question. I love that you wear all of your designs from over the years in your videos, and I wonder if you have kept anything that just didn't work out or make it to the final pattern publishing stage. Yes, 100%. I probably have at least one pattern a year that does not make it to publication. Well, okay, maybe not that many. Every couple years for sure though. Or ideas that I just scratch, you know, like maybe even I get into the swatching stage or get it partially knit and realize, no, this isn't either A, it's not bringing me joy to knit it, which then I don't trust it'll bring other people joy to knit it. And so not going to keep going. So there are things like that definitely happen, but I do have at least 2 sweaters that I completely knit that did not make it to publication. One even made it all the way through testing, and then I scratched it. Oops. And another, I just knit it for me. So basically with the first one, it got all the way through testing, and I felt like through the testing process and the results of it, it wasn't as good as it needed to be for me to publish it. So yeah, I think it's really challenging that I was also working with a yarn company on that. We'd already worked together and had a lot of fun working together. So it was hard to be like, hey, we thought we were going to have this sweater to launch, but I just don't think it's good enough. And they were really awesome about it, because it's a hard thing to do, to be like, oh, this one, failure is a strong word, but I also think that that's just part of life. If you really want to see a doozy, I recommend going deep back into my Instagram. I should probably just repost it. From a couple years ago, I posted when I attempted to get into the second Stitch and Bitch book, and I show what my, oh my gosh, what's it called? Darn it. Sometimes the words just aren't there. Submission. What you can see what my submission was. It's painfully bad. And it was hard, that rejection. But it just wasn't time for me yet in this. So anyways, I kind of talk all about failure in that post, so it's worth taking a peek if you're interested. And then shortly before we moved to Maine, I knit up, I wonder where it is. I think I actually, it's gonna be, I won't take that much time to go dig it out, but I knit a really, really cute little brioche bomber jacket using Surrey alpaca and a single ply fingering weight yarn that was all like frosty blue. It was so cute. But wow, it was a challenge to knit up, and by the time I finished my sample, I realized it would not grade well into other sizes. It would lose the look of it, depending on the shaping I needed to do, especially for the sleeves. And so I just realized I didn't want to put something out there that wouldn't have its integrity for the entire size range. So, you know, I just try to look at that one as like, well, there's one that's just for me. Oh, I had a shawl last year. I used some of like my favorite yarn in my stash that I'd kind of been saving. And I actually was trying to do a shawl that looked like Velocore, which is one of my sweater patterns. And I was so excited about it. I thought it was looking so good. And then I put it on waste yarn to check it out. And the way that that stitch pattern worked with the shaping just was not, I was not happy with it. And so then I restarted it and I still wasn't happy with it. And it's still living in a bag hanging over on my wall over there because I'm just like, oh, so sad. And I kind of had to cut into the yarn a bit. So like I'm definitely have lost some of that precious yarn, but someday I might revisit it and figure out how to make it work. It's interesting too, how sometimes you do have to put things in timeout for like a year. And then there's a little light bulb and you're like, oh, this is how I can do this and make it work. So who knows, maybe even those earlier patterns that I scratched, they might come back anew where I can fix some of the problems that I couldn't figure out before, especially as we continue to learn and figure out new techniques and stuff like that. So 100% I have total design fails. And yeah, I mean, I've spoken on here before. I am a huge fan of frogging for joy. One of the great things about being a knitter is that we can unravel. So I've also knit up sweaters even before I was a designer that then maybe I wore for a few days and just realized like, this is not me, it's not fitting right. And I unraveled it and reused the yarn for something else. So I think that it's good to take advantage of the fact that we can reuse that yarn. All right. Next question. My question is about picking up button band stitches on cardigans that have selvage stitches. I saw in your previous videos you showed how to pick up the little strand of yarn in between, but now that I'm knitting on my Stria cardigan, I can't really seem to get it right. The pattern suggests using the selvage stitch as a guide, so I've picked up through 2 legs of a stitch vertically, but I still can't seem to get it pretty. How did you do this on yours? Your button band looks so smooth and perfect. Well, thank you. So I just have some kind of general button band tips. I have spoken in previous episodes, like my favorite ratio for picking up button band stitches is 5 to 7. So when you look at your row of knitting, if you kind of spread out that selvage stitch, like your edge stitch, and kind of pull that up, you'll see these little bars. And so you would want to pick up 5 stitches for every 7 spaces. So the way between those bars. So again, I kind of think I showed this better in a previous episode, but I'll just do a recap. So I would do like, I would pick up, let's say there's 3 spaces. So you got like 3 little bars. I would pick up 2 stitches and then I would skip a space. And then for the next 4, I would do 3 stitches. And that's how I would get the 5 out of 7. I find that that is a really, really balanced ratio to pick up stitches. But I do think picking up stitches for things like button bands, it can be intimidating because a lot of times, especially for something that's like a full button band or a shawl collar, it's a lot of stitches to pick up. So I highly recommend using lockable stitch markers to help space those. So basically the pattern's going to tell you about how many stitches you need to pick up. So I would take my length, let's say it's one side of a cardigan, and at first I would fold that in half and I would put a marker at the fold line, and then I would, now you have 2 halves, and then I would fold that in half again, and I would just keep breaking down sections to as small as you need to evenly pick up stitches. So let's say, I'm just gonna throw a random number out there. Let's say you need to pick up 100 stitches for one side of your cardigan. So once you have taken that edge, that I don't have a cardigan right here, I really wish I did. But let's just say this is the edge, okay? So what I mean is I would fold that one edge in half, and then where I folded it, I would put a little locking stitch marker. And now I know if I'm picking up 100 stitches along the whole length, now I know I'm doing 50 on each side. So then if I fold one of my halves again, place a marker here, now I'm down to 25 stitches in a section. So you can keep doing that. So the smaller you make your sections, the easier it'll end up being to evenly space them out without it being stressful. It's also a lot easier to count. You know, if you can get yourself into 10 sections for that 100 stitches, you know that you just have to do 10 stitches per section. And it just, I think, removes some of the stress. And I will also say, there are often times that I need to, I would say at least half the time, maybe more, that I will pick up stitches for a button band and be like, I could have spaced those better, and I'll redo it. It's better to redo it right out the gate than to knit that whole button band and be like, ooh. That being said too, remember in knitting, blocking is magic. So even if you're like, I don't know how great this looks, especially if it's a ribbed button band, that's going to block and open up and look very different than it does right after you freshly knit it. So keep that in mind too, to not judge it until after blocking. But again, the good thing about a button band is you can redo it as many times as you need to get it the way that you like it. Okay, let's end this with a little spinning question. So sadly, I have still not gotten much time on my wheels this week. I showed this lovely bat that I have been working on. It has all these beautiful, see this like sari silk, very beautiful, from Artifacts of Appreciation, that I am spinning up with 2 braids. I think they might both be from Hello Yarn. I have one right here, I'm gonna grab it. So the other one, which is downstairs, is much more, it has quite a bit. It's always like trying to figure out how to get the lighting so you can see colors better, because I don't want to take this off his bag right now. But it has a lot of like purple kind of berry colors with some orangey ochre colors. So that's going to be apply. This is going to be apply. And my bat's going to be apply, which is going to equal some pretty decent yardage. And I'm just experimenting, and I'm really excited to see what's going to happen. So that is what I'm spinning, but I seriously have been getting maybe 5 minutes of spinning time a day. I have just a lot of work to do right now, and I sadly haven't been having much time at my wheel. So even when I get up early in the morning, which I usually like always keep as like my special spinning time, I've had to be knitting, which is exciting because that means new patterns. But yeah, I don't know, maybe I've just slowed down. But anyways, I will hopefully be back with some fresh yarn to show you soon. I do have my first hand spun pattern, kind of my first. I did use my hand spun and my curio socks for the knit along. But my first bigger pattern, I have a shawl coming out next week, just a few days on Tuesday, that uses my hand spun yarn. So I cannot wait to show that to all of you. I've definitely shown some sneak peeks, but it will officially be here next week. Let's get back to this question. I kind of got distracted by all the hand spun. All right, I am a new spinner and I'm having difficulty finding a pattern that suits my spun yarn. Have you knitted any of your spun yarn into a sweater or cardigan? I have, and I brought a stack to show you. So, I don't know what I was gonna say there, I lost it. I feel like I have like too many thoughts flying to my brain at once that I want to say them all, and then I'm like, okay, gotta sort through it. So yes, I 100%, this is the first sweater I knit out of my hand spun. So this is a nurtured sweater. I've worn it on here before. This is my first hand spun sweater. I actually spun this yarn shortly after I learned how to spin. Like I learned in the spring and I spun this starting in the summer. And it is with a mostly Maine, might be all Maine grown fiber. Sorry, distracted. So yeah, I think Nurtured is a great sweater for hand spun, because that texture, especially in the beginning, the texture kind of helps. I won't even say hide, because it's not a matter of hiding. I find that maybe I need more coffee. Where are all my words today? They're out there. They're outside, out that window. Enhance the texture? Yeah, let's go with that. I find that this texture enhances the properties of that early hand spun that can often be quite thick and thin, not super even. So I just think that they work really well together. So this is the Nurtured pullover. And then another sweater I have worn on here, which is actually, so this is the right side. I like to wear it inside out because I think it blends the colors nicer. But this is my DRK everyday sweater, which is also, oh, a little wrinkly. But this is knit out of my hand spun. This was a fun little, just like spinning experiment, where I had no idea what would happen with the color. So that is DRK everyday. And then this is my sun sweater. So this was, I think, the second sweater I knit out of my hand spun. My good friend Kay sent me this natural wool, from a woman that she knows, I think in upstate New York, who this breed of sheep was specifically for hand spinning. Yeah. And anyways, so I used that for his sweater. And then this blue was actually from my friends over at Spin Cycle, gave me some fiber. And so I used that for the color work. And I just made the sweater up as I went. It basically is a riff on my stone crop pullover and cardigan. So yeah, anyways. That is all. And this was also early on. And it's interesting because sometimes I think, there's a beeping out there. I'm sorry if you can hear it. I think we can really judge our yarns maybe a little too much when they're just in the skein and we haven't knit with them yet. And it's amazing how even those early yarns that might be a little lumpy bumpy, which is nothing wrong with that. I mean, texture is fabulous. But it's amazing how different they can look once they're knit up. So I do, again, I think just knitting with your hand spun shows so much. I love this little sweater. Kind of wish it was mine. It's already getting to be too small on my son, which is like, oh, we'll have to tuck that away for another little person to wear someday. Okay, so there's my hand spun sweaters. I also love using my hand spun for socks. I have some that I want to use for some hats, shawls, the whole 9 yards. So if you can try and figure out about what weight your yarn is, then I would just search for a pattern like that. But like a hat, I think is such a good way to go because there are so many hat patterns, and it can be a really good way to see how that hand spun's gonna knit up. Oh, that's what else I wanted to say. I'm so happy I actually gave myself a little note here. So we are in the final days of the DRK Spin It to Knit It Knit Along, where we have been knitting our DRK everyday socks. And I just think it's been so wonderful that I just feel like it should be an ongoing thing. So I am thinking about, I kind of posted about this on Instagram the other day, but I am thinking about continuing it and trying to decide what the next pattern should be. I do have that shawl coming out, so that could be a really good one. I also selfishly think about what I want to spin and knit for next. And I kind of want to do another sweater. I even thought the Weekender could be fun. I just feel like that would be such a great canvas for some hand spun. So I would love to hear from you. And as before, non-spinners would be 100% welcome. You can just skip the spinning part and just get right into the knitting part. So anyway, so if there's just something you want to be able to knit, feel free to throw it into the comments below. But also, if you're a spinner and you're itching to continue the Spin It to Knit It Knit Along, please let me know what pattern you might be interested in so we can get a little list going. Yeah, I have thoughts. Okay, I guess I'm just gonna end this here. I think we've covered it. DRK March to May knit-alongs going on over in my Ravelry group and also on Instagram. All that information is below. Thank you as always for throwing your questions into that form. That's also linked below. Make sure you're signed up for the newsletter so you can get a little discount on the new shawl next week. And I think that's it. I hope you have a great weekend. We are going to be celebrating my daughter who is turning 8, and I can't even believe that we've had 8 wonderful years with her already. So that's what we're going to be doing. Cupcakes, arts and crafts, all the good stuff. I hope you have a lovely weekend too, and I'll see you later. Happy knitting.